Most wars do not begin with declarations. They begin with assumptions. Assumptions about deterrence, about limits, about how far an adversary is willing to go. The current confrontation involving Iran, Israel, and the United States is often described as a series of isolated flare-ups, missile exchanges, proxy clashes, airstrikes, sanctions. But what if this moment is not a temporary spike in tension, but a structural stress test of the entire regional order? And if so, what would determine whether it expands further? To understand the risk of escalation, we need to separate headlines from incentives. Israel views Iran's regional network, including armed groups in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, as a long-term security threat. Iran, for its part, sees forward positioning across the region as a form of deterrence, a way to push confrontation away from its own borders. The United States sits in between, committed to Israel's security while also trying to prevent a wider war that could destabilize global energy markets and draw American forces into another prolonged conflict. This triangular tension is not new. It has developed over decades through proxy conflict, indirect confrontation using allied non-state actors rather than direct state-to-state warfare. Proxy conflict allows each side to apply pressure while maintaining plausible deniability. It keeps escalation controlled. But the risk today lies in miscalculation, when actions intended as limited signals are interpreted as existential threats. Why does this moment feel different? Because several constraints that once limited escalation are under strain. Iran faces sustained economic pressure from sanctions, financial penalties that restrict its ability to sell oil, access international banking systems, and attract foreign investment. Sanctions reduce state revenue, weaken currency stability, and increase inflation at home. For leaders under economic pressure, projecting strength externally can serve both strategic and domestic purposes. Israel, meanwhile, has become increasingly direct in targeting Iranian positions in Syria and elsewhere, aiming to prevent weapons transfers and strategic entrenchment. From Israel's perspective, delaying action increases long-term risk, but direct strikes raise the possibility of retaliation that moves beyond the shadows. The United States must weigh deterrence against overextension. It maintains military assets across the region to protect trade routes and allies. Yet Washington is also navigating high sovereign debt levels, domestic political polarization, and global strategic competition elsewhere. Full-scale regional war would impose financial costs, strain defense budgets, and potentially disrupt already fragile supply chains. Energy markets sit at the center of this equation. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil consumption passes through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow maritime chokepoint between the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea. A chokepoint is a geographic bottleneck where disruption can affect global supply. Even the perception of risk there can drive oil prices upward. When oil prices rise sharply, it feeds inflation globally, raising transport, manufacturing, and food costs. Inflation is not just an economic statistic. It influences interest rates, consumer confidence, and government borrowing costs. Central banks respond to inflation by tightening monetary policy, raising interest rates to slow spending. But higher rates increase the cost of servicing national debt. In a world already carrying historically high debt loads, energy-driven inflation becomes more than a regional issue. It becomes a systemic financial concern. This is why markets react quickly to even limited escalations. Oil futures spike on uncertainty. Gold, traditionally seen as a hedge against instability, attracts capital. Equity markets become volatile. Investors reassess risk premiums, the extra return demanded for holding assets in uncertain conditions. In that sense, escalation is not measured only in missiles, but in market spreads and insurance costs. Yet expansion is not inevitable. All three actors understand the cost of full war. Iran's economy depends heavily on oil exports, even under sanctions. A major regional conflict could damage infrastructure and reduce revenue further. Israel's economy, deeply integrated into global technology and capital markets, would suffer from prolonged instability. The United States would face both financial and political consequences from deeper military engagement. The structural forces beneath the surface complicate this calculation. Iran has gradually strengthened ties with countries seeking alternatives to Western financial dominance. This includes increased energy trade with Asian partners and participation in regional economic forums. While these relationships provide breathing room, they do not fully replace access to the global dollar-based financial system. Sanctions still limit liquidity and currency stability. Israel, on the other hand, has expanded diplomatic ties with several Arab states in recent years. These normalization agreements shift regional alignment patterns. They create new economic corridors and defense cooperation channels. But they also heighten strategic competition with Iran, which views such alignments as containment. Political timing matters as well. Leadership cycles influence risk tolerance. Governments facing domestic pressure sometimes adopt firmer external postures. Yet domestic pressure can also constrain escalation if economic fragility makes prolonged conflict unsustainable. High youth unemployment, inflation, and currency depreciation reduce the appetite for open war in many societies. Another structural factor is the transformation of warfare itself. Precision missiles, drones, and cyber capabilities lower the cost of targeted strikes. They allow calibrated responses, but they also compress decision time. When retaliation can occur within minutes rather than weeks, the window for diplomatic de-escalation narrows. Global supply chains amplify the stakes. The Middle East is not only an energy hub, but also a transit zone for goods moving between Asia and Europe. Disruptions in the Red Sea or Persian Gulf increase shipping insurance premiums and force rerouting around longer paths. Higher transport costs feed directly into consumer prices worldwide. What begins as a regional security event becomes an inflationary ripple affecting households far beyond the conflict zone. Financial markets translate geopolitical tension into measurable signals. Currency markets respond to capital flight, the movement of money out of perceived high-risk regions into safer assets. Emerging market currencies can weaken rapidly during crises, increasing the cost of imports and external debt repayment. If oil prices spike simultaneously, oil-importing countries face a double burden: weaker currency and higher energy costs. The United States calculates escalation partly through this lens. It must consider not only battlefield outcomes but bond markets, energy futures, and alliance credibility. A failure to deter attacks risks undermining regional partnerships. Overreaction risks triggering exactly the supply shock it seeks to avoid. A supply shock is a sudden reduction in the availability of key goods, in this case, oil, that pushes prices sharply higher. So could this war expand further? The answer depends less on rhetoric and more on thresholds. Expansion becomes more likely if direct state-to-state attacks cross red lines involving civilian infrastructure, energy facilities, or territory. It becomes more likely if proxy confrontations spiral beyond limited objectives. But it becomes less likely when economic cost clearly outweighs strategic gain. History shows that regional powers often calibrate conflict carefully. Even during periods of intense hostility, back-channel communication and mutual awareness of limits have prevented direct total war. The logic of deterrence, convincing the other side that escalation would be too costly, remains central. At the same time, deterrence is fragile. It relies on accurate perception. In an environment saturated with rapid information flows and domestic political pressure, misinterpretation becomes a real risk. The more complex the web of alliances and proxy actors, the harder it is to control every variable. For global observers, the key indicator is not a single strike or statement. It is whether economic systems begin to fracture. Sustained oil prices above certain thresholds, sharp spikes in shipping insurance, significant currency volatility in regional economies, or emergency central bank interventions would signal that conflict is moving from contained to systemic. Modern power operates through energy flows, trade corridors, capital markets, and digital networks as much as through military hardware. That interconnected structure both restrains and magnifies conflict. It restrains because disruption is costly to all. It magnifies because localized instability transmits rapidly across financial systems. If this helped you see the bigger picture, take a moment to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Rise and Ruin, Power of Wealth for more documentaries on oil, power, and the forces shaping global finance. The real question is not whether tensions exist, they clearly do, but whether the systems binding these rivals together economically will continue to outweigh the forces pulling them apart strategically.